So in epistemology, we speak about testimony in any case where somebody makes a factual claim and other people are around to hear it or read it or whatever, and so they might come to believe that claim. So that's what we call testimony. And in the previous video, we saw that there is an important question about testimony, which is when am I justified in believing it? And that there are two broad answers to that. One is called reductionism, and the other is called anti-reductionism. And the reductionist tells us that we are justified in believing testimony when we have good reasons to believe that this speaker or writer is reliable. Right? So we are allowed to believe testimony. We are justified in believing testimony when we have good reasons to believe that it's going to be right. On the other hand, the anti-reductionist, who is the focus of this video, tells us that we are allowed or justified to believe testimony unless there are reasons not to believe it, right? Unless there are reasons to believe that this person is not reliable. So, whereas the reductionist has a basic picture of the epistemic agent as somebody who has to decide everything for themselves, who can in the end rely only on their own experience, and so they need reasons before they believe other people, right? They need to check, for instance, whether other people are reliable. By contrast, the anti-reductionist who says, no, you can just believe people unless there are special reasons not to. So you can just believe people. That's sort of the place where we start from. So the anti-reductionist sees human beings as inherently social beings whose epistemic success requires trust, right? We need to trust other people to get to know things. Maybe we even need to trust other people to start with the project of knowledge, right? That would be a very powerful picture that could lie behind anti-reductionism. The idea that only as social beings can we be epistemic beings at all. Anti-reductionist doesn't maybe have to believe that, but if you believe that, you're certainly going to be an anti-reductionist. Okay, so anti-reductionists, so people who believe that we don't need positive reasons to believe people, we should just believe people unless we've got a reason not to. Anti-reductionists have given several types of arguments in favor of their view, and I want to discuss three of them. So the first argument in favor of anti-reductionism starts by pointing out that children are clearly operating in an anti-reductionist way. Right? Children have to learn everything, and they learn it from their parents or from other adult human beings in their environment. And children don't go around wondering whether to trust those adults. And if they try to do that, right, if a child came into the world and thought, I don't think they could think it, but suppose they came into the world and they thought, well, I'm not sure whether anything those adults tell me is right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to suspend judgment until I've been able to investigate the world myself, and then I'll check whether those adults were on the right track. That clearly doesn't work, right? If a child doesn't trust adults, if a child doesn't learn things from adults, they'll never even be in a position where they can investigate the world, right? They'll never learn enough they won't even learn enough to talk, right? I mean, imagine a child and the child sees their father or mother pointing at an apple saying, apple, that's an apple, little Jimmy. And little Jimmy thinks, yeah, that's what you say. Well, I don't know whether that's really called an apple. I'm going to check it out later. You wouldn't even be able to learn language, right? If that were the way that you handled yourself. Okay, so children clearly follow an anti-reductionist sort of way of moving around the world. Now, that doesn't prove by itself that anti-reductionism is true, right? Because maybe children aren't fully rational agents yet. I mean, clearly children are not, they don't have justification in the way that an adult human being might have justification. And so here's an idea that the reductionists have tried. They say, well, look, yes, as children, that's how we operate, but at a certain point you become mature. And when you're mature, then you get into this reductionist way of dealing with things. Right now you've experienced enough about the world to judge whether people are reliable or not. And that's going to be the basis of your justifications from now on. So it's a sort of two-stage view, right? There's children and there's adults. And one way for the anti-reductionist to respond to that is to say, well, that's too simplistic. I mean, there is a sense in which we are always people who have to rely on others, right? If I learn a new language, I've got to rely on what people tell me about that language. If I start studying a new topic, something I know nothing about, I've got to rely on people telling me about that topic, right? So the idea that there's a switch at some point in your life from being a learner who is dependent on other people to being an epistemic agent who is dependent only on themselves, really, for fundamental justification, that picture just isn't very realistic. Or at least that's what the anti-reductionist might say. So that's the first argument you might give for anti-reductionism. Here's a second argument for anti-reductionism. So the anti-reductionist might point out that it's not so strange to claim that we just have to trust other people unless we have reasons not to, because in fact that's how we have to deal with our other sources of truth, our other sources of knowledge as well. So for instance, take perception. Right? Suppose that you said, well, I only believe my senses if I have a good reason to think that they're reliable. Right? So for instance, I only believe my eyes, looking around the room now, I only believe my eyes if I have good reasons to believe that my eyes are reliable, that they tell me the truth, that they show me the world as it is. Well, what reason could I have for that? Right? I mean, one thing I could try to do is I could, write down a lot of visual observations I have and then check whether they're true. But how do I check whether they're true? Right? I mean, I've got to know something about the world, but if I don't trust my senses, how am I going to get any knowledge about the world? That seems hard, right? In fact, that seems the road to skepticism. If you think you need positive reasons to trust your senses before you can believe what your senses tell you, well, then it's hard to see where those positive reasons could ever come from. And so it seems that you're well on your way towards a skepticism about the external world. And so the anti-reductionist might say, look, in practice, I mean, what we do is we trust our senses unless there's a reason not to. Right? If it's very dark, maybe I don't trust my eyes as much. If I saw something just for a moment, well, it seemed like an elephant out there, but I saw it only for such a short moment. Maybe I'm wrong, right? I mean, then I don't trust my senses. But I usually trust them unless I have a reason not to. So the same with memory, right? I mean, if I want to know whether my memory is reliable, it seems that I'll always have to rely on something like my memory to check. And so how we actually deal with memory is that we trust it unless we have reasons not to. Right? I mean, I trust it unless I think, well, actually, this is a story that I know my mother has taught me a couple of times. So I'm not sure whether this memory is genuine or whether I just, sort of retroactively got this memory because of the stories that my mother used to tell me about. So I think this makes sense, right? As a story about how we use other sources of knowledge, we trust them unless we have reasons not to. That makes some sense. And if you think that makes sense, then treating testimony the same way might not be such a strange move, right? It just means that you handle testimony in the same way as all your other sources of knowledge. Okay, so that might be a second kind of argument that the anti-reductionist puts forward. The third kind of argument that the anti-reductionist may put forward is something that we might go as far as to call a kind of transcendental argument. Right? And it would be an argument that says, well, unless you trust people, right? Unless you trust people without first requiring reason, so unless you really trust them, you can't be an epistemic agent. Right? That would be a strong kind of claim to make. And it has the shape of what we call a transcendental argument. Right? I mean, given that you are the kind of person that you clearly are, somebody who even asks these epistemological questions, It's got to be the case that you start out trusting people, because otherwise you couldn't be this kind of person. Okay, how does that work? Well, I already gave a sort of example of that when I said that maybe you can't even acquire a language if you don't trust people, right? If I don't trust other speakers to use words in the correct way, right? To mean apple when they say apple, to be right when they point at an apple and say apple. If I don't trust people to do that, then it seems fairly clear that I wouldn't be able to learn a language, right? In fact, if I didn't just believe that people spoke the truth most of the time, it's hard to see how I could get any knowledge of a language. So let me give an example. How do I know what an elephant is? How do I know what an elephant is? Well, people have said things to me, and I've read things like an elephant is a big animal. There are two species of elephant, the African elephant and the Indian elephant. Elephants have tusks. Elephants have trunks. Elephants are kind of dangerous if you stand next to them. Went to the zoo. I saw these big animals, and there was a sign which said, these are the elephants. Right? I mean, all of that is people making claims, and it is by believing them, by trusting these claims to be true, that I get to know what the word elephant even refers to. And if I don't believe these claims, if I say, well, I'm first going to check whether they're reliable. How do I even decide whether these are reliable claims about animals, or whether everybody is completely wrong about storks, right? Maybe the word the word elephant really refers to a stork, and everybody who's saying things about elephants, that is storks, is just plain wrong, right? They're wrong when they say that elephants have trunks because elephants have beaks. And they're wrong when they say that elephants live in Africa and India because, they live over here perfectly fine. And they're wrong if they say that elephants are very heavy because actually they have big wings and they can fly. How do I even, unless I trust people, how do I even know which of these two situations obtains? Right? The situation where people are right about elephants, or the situation where they are really, really wrong about storks. If this sounds like a slightly insane thought experiment, that's the idea, right? The idea is that, no, of course we trust people, and that's how there can be such a thing as language, how there can be such a thing as communication. If we didn't trust people, that wouldn't even exist. And so if we didn't trust people, we couldn't even be in the situation where we wonder whether they speak the truth. Because if they don't have language, if we don't have language, if we can't communicate, there's no question of whether anyone speaks the truth. Okay, so that's an example of a kind of transcendental argument that somebody might give, right? And the idea would be, if you are the kind of person who even wonders whether people speak the truth, clearly you trust people to speak the truth most of the time. Okay, so I already sort of put my cards on the table in the previous video and said that, I think that this anti-reductionist story fits what we are as human beings pretty well. And I think the kind of transcendental argument that I gave just now is pretty strong. But reductionism is alive and well in the literature. So there are definitely people who are not, they don't accept these arguments. They don't think that there are lots of people who do not accept the anti-reductionist arguments, and so they still embrace reductionism. You got to think through these issues for yourself, as always. Here's just one conclusion I want to draw from anti-reductionism. I mean, suppose you accept anti-reductionism, right? Then, in order to get knowledge, you need more than skills of observation and reasoning and so on. Right? You need more than that. You need more than intelligence and acuity. you also need trust. You need to be the kind of person who trusts other people in order to get knowledge. Because you're just not even justified in believing testimony if you don't trust other people. And if you don't have access to testimony, then there's really very little that you can learn about the world. And so it seems that getting knowledge requires you to have a certain kind of character, right? A trusting character. You need to be the kind of person who has a positive attitude towards other people and who isn't very suspicious and who's willing to sort of, work together with them. And so knowledge would seem to require maybe even some kind of virtue, some kind of love, we might almost say, right? You've got to have a positive attitude towards other people to ever become somebody who knows. And I think that's both true and important, right? It's important that the epistemic is not something that is abstract and isolated from the rest of our lives, but it is right there in, it's right there with ethics, it's right there maybe with politics, it's right there with how we live our lives, how we understand ourselves, how we understand our relations to other people. All of that is connected. Epistemology is not this sort of, dry theoretical subject that has nothing to do with us and other people, but only with, trying to get some lists of truths. No, it has to do with who you are and how you behave and how you relate to others. I think that's a nice lesson to get from thinking about testimony.